Welcome everybody to the first fall seminar for the NCRCRD. And we have two great speakers today talking about entrepreneurship in rural communities. Our first speaker is Jenny, well, I know as Jenny Beth, Dr. Jennifer Johnson Jorgensen from the University of Nebraska. And Dr. Jorgensen is an assistant professor in the Department of Textiles, Merchandising, and Fashion Design at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her research consists of two interrelated threads. First, her research focuses on rural retail vitality and how small retailers utilize technologies and other resources to survive over time. This topic involves the investigation of entrepreneurial ecosystems, as well as how to navigate the challenges encountered within the retail landscape. Second, her research focuses on the consumer and how consumers are socialized via technology and other influences to consume a product. Dr. Conroy is an economic development specialist and assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics and the Department of Extension. She studies community economic growth and development and small business dynamics and entrepreneurship. I think we're going to learn a lot from these two wonderful assistant professors. And so I will stop sharing and allow you to share your screen, Jenny Beth, to get us started.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you the study on stakeholder perceptions of entrepreneurial ecosystems in rural communities, and just a little bit of background about me and kind of what led me to engage in research on this topic. This topic is very near and dear to my heart as I grew up in northern Minnesota in a rural area, and my parents were entrepreneurs. And of course, my sister and I were very much a part of those businesses. And one of those businesses was successful, the other two were not. So I was able to see the struggle that rural entrepreneurs often encounter due to a variety of reasons, but many of those reasons can be unique to the communities that they serve. So I do bracket out my own personal experiences when I'm working on these studies, but I feel like the methodology that we chose and the purpose of these studies are based on some of those identified problems and experiences. And of course, that's what makes me so passionate about this topic. So what I'm going to discuss with you today is mainly focused on a study done with two ecosystems in rural Nebraska. However, I've worked with my colleague, Dr. Andrew Zimbroff, to also use these developed procedures in rural areas of Bangladesh and Australia as well. I'll share just a little bit about those two other studies at the very end, but ultimately I felt like the information about rural Nebraska might be more of interest in particular. So I wanted to start with a brief overview of why we are doing this and why we are using Q methodology embedded in a mixed method study. So we know that quantitative methods are used so that we can gain a lot of data, and hopefully that data is representative of the population that we're trying to reach. But sometimes quantitative research can fall short when investigating some of these complex problems. So again, with quantitative, we sometimes miss out on those little details that can make a really big difference in the problems that we're trying to investigate. And then of course, on the other side, we also know the limitations of qualitative research, where you can't generalize the findings typically, data collection can be complicated and those types of things. So what did we decide to do? We of course wanted to use all of these different methodologies. So we used mixed methods centered around Q methodology. And so essentially we combined all of the benefits and challenges of each of these methods, which we of course found to be wonderful in many ways and kind of a headache in other ways too. And our main problem is that there are many rural communities that are struggling in a variety of ways. And we know that entrepreneurship is vital for the economic growth of rural communities. So why aren't entrepreneurs starting businesses in rural communities? So in order to answer this question, we need to understand the perceptions that community stakeholders have on entrepreneurial activities in the rural entrepreneurial ecosystem. So ultimately, our purpose was to explain and explore these perceptions to determine what barriers currently exist for specific rural ecosystems. So keep in mind, we are not trying to be generalizable at this stage of our investigation. We need to know more about the specifics of these communities before we can actually delve into collecting data for the masses. But we also feel that generalizable results for this topic will not be a one-size-fits-all solution. So specifically for this study, we wanted to investigate what we consider to be a large rural ecosystem and also a small rural ecosystem in the state of Nebraska, and then of course expand across the state from there. So some of you may be familiar with Q methodology, but I wanted to provide just a brief description of what it is. Q methodology just within itself is considered to be a mixed method. So with the data collected for a Q study, we were able to do a statistical analysis to determine different patterns that were found. We also were able to dig into how participants feel about the information they were presented in these discussions with our participants. So for Q, we are using Q sorts as a measurement tool for gathering these perceptions. Oops. See if we can find our place here. All right, so a Q sort looks like the one on the right side of the screen. It is essentially a diagram, and participants fill this diagram with statements. And these statements are called the Q set for the study. And the Q set is based on a concourse developed on the topic, where we investigated literature, surveys, and we also interviewed experts in the field to gain all of these terms and main components of this topic. And then from these sources, we then grouped similar terms together to narrow down the number of statements that participants would use for the Q sort while we were making sure that we had a comprehensive set of statements that fully represented the problem at hand. And then after we started combining all of these terms together, after that process, we had 29 unique statements. And we had those statements vetted by experts in the field, so we could make sure that they were comprehensive on the problem we were trying to investigate. So, and then after that, our participants were provided these statements when we met with them, and they were asked to place those statements within the Q sort. And during that process, they would talk about their thought process as to why they were placing each statement where they were within the Q sort grid. So using this Q sort, it forces participants to rank each statement. And that is probably the thing I love the most about Q methodology, is it forces that ranking. And I've had quantitative studies where a lot of participants will say strongly agree for almost every item in your survey. And what does that really tell you? So I love that participants have to choose which statements are most impactful for them. Oh, see? There we go. So to accomplish this purpose, we used an embedded mixed methods approach that utilized quantitative, qualitative, and Q methodology. However, Q methods was the primary phase of this mixed methods study. So for the Q part of the study, again, participants were asked to physically sort these 29 statements into a Q sort grid. And then for the quantitative part of the study, we drew comparisons between our data and data from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. And ultimately, we were curious to see if there were similarities or major differences. And then for the qualitative portion, we conducted interviews with the participants to further expand upon the Q sorts. And that's the part I love the most, because you really get to understand why people are putting the statements they are in the Q sort, or where they are putting those statements. And you get to hear stories, which is always great. So as briefly mentioned in the first slide, we investigated 2 unique communities. Our first community was Broken Bow, Nebraska, and it has a population of a little over 3,500 people. And we've deemed this community a small rural community. It's also not geographically located to a larger town. And then the second community was Hastings, Nebraska. And this particular town has a population of close to 25,000 people, and we've deemed this community a large rural community. So within each of these communities, we purposefully sought out specific stakeholders that would be able to provide their diverse viewpoints on their communities. And we did have a gatekeeper in each of these communities that could help us identify these individuals. And then we had 3 phases, of course, that our participants went through during the data collection process. The participants did do a short survey in which the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor was a foundation, and we also collected demographic information on this survey. Now, with different Q studies that I've worked on, sometimes demographic information, demographics play a large role in the results, and sometimes they don't at all. It just completely depends on the topic at hand. And I'm actually a part of a conference that's going on right now and presented something similar to this earlier today, actually. But one of the discussions we had was, are demographics actually all that important when we're really trying to get to the root of an issue? So there's a great debate on that, and I'll definitely fill you in later if I find out more, if we come to a consensus on it. All right, and then with phase 2, our primary means of collecting data was from the Q-sort. That's really where we were putting a lot of our attention. And again, participants were asked to rank each of the 29 statements that we presented to them into a Q-sort grid. And our statements were based on literature and information from experts in the field. And so on the screen on the right-hand side, there are some example statements. And I didn't provide all 29 statements because this research is ongoing, but I wanted to give you an idea of the type of statements that participants were looking at and what they were trying to consider when they were placing these statements within the Q-sort grid. Now, on the left side of the screen, you can see someone looking at cards that have the statements on them and then physically sorting the statements onto the Q-sort grid. And that is what our participants did. It's a very physical process, and it's amazing how seriously participants take this. There are a lot of participants that will say, oh my goodness, this is so difficult to decide which statements should belong in which spaces on this Q-sort grid. And so it's just a fun process to see. So once the Q-sort was complete, an interview was conducted with participants, and the participants were asked why they put the statements into certain categories on the Q-sort, and then they were also asked to expand on their decisions. And so we received a lot of great stories of things that have happened in their community or the challenges that occur in each of these communities. So then to analyze the quantitative data, we simply use Microsoft Excel to outline comparisons with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. More extensive stats simply they weren't needed for this purpose, for this study. And then to analyze Q methods, we used CADE software, and we conducted a multiple components analysis with Verimax rotation. And then to analyze the qualitative interviews, we used MaxQDA to help us code the data. And the coding process was outlined by grounded theory, particularly Charmez's approach to grounded theory. And it included 3 rounds of coding before themes started to emerge. So looking at the findings, there were 3 different factors that emerged for our small rural entrepreneurial ecosystem. The first factor is titled Superstars in Small Communities, where it was determined that entrepreneurs are perceived to have status in the community. And participants that loaded purely on this factor also indicated that they felt that developing a business is easier in smaller communities when compared to larger ones. And the second factor highlights how inequalities among entrepreneurs are holding back business creation. Overall, a fear of failure is stopping new businesses from being formed. And we won't be able to delve very deeply into the qualitative themes in this presentation, but information gained during the interviews highlighted some of the different reasons why fear of failure exists. And then inequalities were also found between male and female entrepreneurs, where there were fewer female entrepreneurs in the community, and it's perceived that female entrepreneurs have more limited opportunities than male entrepreneurs. But kind of in contrast, but still staying within that same factor, participants that loaded on this factor also stated that mentors are willing to assist other entrepreneurs. So there's that great relationship that is developing among people within the community. And then the third factor highlights that large businesses in the community are helping to support entrepreneurship in the community, but those large businesses are ultimately in charge. It was also viewed that gaining international sales weren't realistic for small and rural businesses, at least at this time. And this factor also highlights that limited funding sources exist in this rural community. So then moving on to our large rural community, 4 factors emerged from this data. The first factor is titled abundant opportunities, and it basically highlights a lot of resources exist for entrepreneurs in the community, including funding and other supports. And it was also found that consumers in the community don't favor older businesses over new ones. So great news for people trying to create new businesses within that community. And then the second factor highlights that mentorship exists in the community and how there are many mentors that are easily accessible. And then what's interesting about this factor is that the transportation infrastructure was considered not to be sufficient within the community. And then our third factor for our large rural community delves into the telecommunication infrastructure. And basically they were stating that the telecommunication infrastructure was sufficient, and that could ultimately lead to other online opportunities for their business. But there is a smaller or more limited rate of growth for new businesses in that community. And then our fourth factor feels like there are limited opportunities to start businesses in the near future. Now, we of course have to take into consideration that this study was happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that may have played a role in that particular factor. However, these participants felt that entrepreneurs don't necessarily start their businesses for an income, but start their businesses for other reasons. And then, as I had briefly mentioned, we've also investigated communities in Bangladesh and Australia. And here's just a very brief, very broad list of the factors that emerged in those studies. So if you're interested in reading more about what we found for entrepreneurial ecosystems in Bangladesh and Australia, those studies are now published, and I'd be happy to share those with you. So ultimately, we found some similarities across all of our investigations into rural communities, but there are, of course, many differences as well. Now, keep in mind with Q methodology and its factors, they are not meant to draw comparisons and differences across all of these different factors. But those similarities and differences are always things we end up discussing, and we potentially test those using quantitative methods in subsequent studies. My colleague also works very closely with rural communities in the state of Nebraska, and he shares the outcome of our research in a workshop form with community stakeholders. So these communities are able to benefit from the specific data that's analyzed on their particular entrepreneurial ecosystem. So thank you so much for having me, and I believe we'll have just a couple of minutes for questions as we transition, and then more time for questions after the presentation or our second presentation. But as Tessa kind of transitions and shares her screen, I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. So I will go ahead and pass it to Tessa and take any questions.
Susanna Benarikova, NCRCRD. May I have a question now or later? Now?
I believe one or
Okay.
two questions.
I have plenty of questions, but just shortly, how many stakeholders did participate in the study, and how did you recruit them?
Absolutely.
This is one question. And the second one is if you have information about the age of the participants and their willingness to establish their own business. Just if you have some results, if there is a difference between young and older people and their willingness to establish a business.
Yes, absolutely. So for Q methodology, typically we have half the number of participants as we do statements. That's kind of a rule of thumb. And so we had about 15 participants for each community. And so of course, we have to take that into consideration, but we did purposefully seek out specific stakeholders in the community so that we had a diverse representation of entrepreneurs, other leaders in the community, those types of things, so that we were able to gain a more holistic view into what was happening in the community. And our recruitment really came from the gatekeeper that we had in each of these communities. And so we accessed that gatekeeper and asked that person, who do you think would be best? Here's the purpose of our study. This is kind of what we want to find out. Who are these people? And that gatekeeper shared with us names and contact information for each of those people. And what's great is these people were very willing to participate. They wanted to share information about their ecosystem, and ultimately they wanted to support their communities. So that was also a great thing to see. And then, oh goodness, did I answer your question? I think there was one more question.
Yes.
Age. Yes, we had diverse age range, and that was a part of seeking out those diverse participants. We had people who had just graduated from undergraduate programs all the way to people who were well into retirement. Within our analysis, we did not see anything major in terms of differences between different demographics with this particular study. So we also found that fascinating. The only factor that had some kind of differentiation in terms of demographics was the factor that identified inequalities between males and females. And there were more females that loaded purely on that factor than males.
Well, that was super interesting, Jenny Beth. Just in the interest of time, we'll move on to Tessa and then have questions at the end, because I'm sure we're all super excited. So Tessa, off you go.
Great. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks to the NCRCRD for hosting us, and Jenny Beth for sharing her time with me. I'm really glad to be presenting today about an extension program. This is called Homegrown Entrepreneurship in Your Community. And I just want to acknowledge my co-creators right off the bat. This is in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Lowe at the University of Missouri. And we also worked really closely with two extension educators that are out in county offices here in Wisconsin. So Diana Hammer and Mia Young were really instrumental to developing this too. And then of course we had funding support from the NCRCRD. So a lot of shared collaboration and effort going into this. And I just want to acknowledge those folks. So I like to start with this quote, and I do this in the program too, because I think it just so nicely captures where we're coming from. So this is from the Kauffman Foundation. And it says, each month, 3 out of every 1,000 people in the United States will start a business. These 3 entrepreneurs take on a tremendous task and assume a great deal of risk. But the remaining 997 people constitute a community that plays a substantial role in the entrepreneur's success. In fact, we depend on these 997 individuals, those who are not entrepreneurs, to support entrepreneurs. So when Sarah and I were getting into our extension programming and thinking about what are the needs out there and how we could use our skills and our research base to meet that need, it came up of, there are programs for entrepreneurs, but programs that support entrepreneurship but aren't for entrepreneurs were less common as far as we could tell. So this was an opportunity to create an entrepreneurial support program that was for the community, that was for everybody else. We definitely recognize that, particularly in rural communities, people wear a lot of hats, and oftentimes they are entrepreneurs among other responsibilities, but we wanted people thinking about the entrepreneurial ecosystem even if they weren't entrepreneurs themselves. So this is a program for key community members in the local entrepreneurial network. So what I mean by key community members is this started with the idea of identifying opinion leaders. And some of you in the audience might know more about this than I do, but I've been learning from my colleagues in life science communication about the importance of opinion leaders in communities. And they were looking for the factors that influence fishermen in adopting more environmentally friendly fishing practices. And they were trying to figure out, who they listened to, who are the influential people in the community. And what they found is that it was actually the people that they were buying their bait and tackle from that were the opinion leaders, the influential people in getting people to identify environmental factor or adopt environmental practices. So this idea of opinion leaders really came home for us in terms of understanding who those people are in the community that are shaping attitudes around entrepreneurship, that are setting norms and have a role in determining culture. So we have those folks in mind when we're thinking about key community members. Unfortunately, we're not as scientific about it, but what came to mind for us were chambers of commerce members, for example, high school teachers who are talking to young people about what they can be when they grow up and maybe thinking of entrepreneurship as a tractable path. We've thought about loan officers as having a key role in the community, particularly around entrepreneurship and business ideas. Other business professionals, such as business service provider professionals, so that could be accountants and lawyers, for example. So anybody who is sort of touching the entrepreneurial ecosystem and has an important role would be the target for this program. And our goal is that participants better understand the breadth and diversity of their entrepreneurial network after the program. Our participants see themselves as part of that network. So the idea that I think it's out there that the entrepreneurial network or entrepreneurial ecosystem is really just entrepreneurs. And we think about it much more broadly than that, that it involves basically everybody in the community has some role to play in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we hope that people will see that and see themselves in that network and in that ecosystem at the end. And that they see a way to engage in the network and more intentionally support entrepreneurs than they have before. So this is what I mean by the entrepreneurial ecosystem. This is a simplification. Examples of and diagrams of the entrepreneurial ecosystem abound. This is a simplification where we have the entrepreneur in the middle, and we're thinking about kind of all the different components of being an entrepreneur and interactions that they will have. So they will need human capital in the form of skilled workers, or they might need to attain human capital themselves. So with that in mind, we think of educators as part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, anybody in the education system. Money, I mentioned already, loan officers, but anybody connected to a rotating loan fund or a CDFI, all of these folks that have to do with capital availability in the community, certainly part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and would be interacting with entrepreneurs. Culture is really inclusive. We can think of almost anybody in the community as sort of promoting or discouraging failure, for example. So how do we think about failure in the community? How do we think about experimentation and risk-taking? So we all have a role to play in culture. Certainly, we all have a role as community members in perhaps being customers, rules and regulations, anybody in government or elected office. Our departments of public health, I keep hearing about in Wisconsin, that they can either be sort of friend or foe of our food entrepreneurs, for example. So we think really broadly about the entrepreneurial ecosystem and see people in all different kinds of roles as having an influence on the success of entrepreneurs, the barriers they see or the opportunities that they see has to do with so many different people within the community. When we think about the Research Foundation, for this program. Sarah and I are both economists, primarily quantitative researchers. And so when we answer the question about what drives an entrepreneurial region, why are some communities more entrepreneurial than others, we see lots of answers to that question. It could be industry. For example, Wisconsin is heavy into manufacturing, which can be antithetical to entrepreneurship. Capital availability is a huge component. So some places have much more active community banks, for example. Human capital and our skill level. Natural amenities tend to attract those skilled and talented folks, so that can be part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Certainly infrastructure, we've been thinking a lot about broadband lately. All of those things matter, but we've become really fascinated with the sort of social component of entrepreneurial regions. So what do the social interactions look like? What does the social network look like? What do peers and role models have to do with entrepreneurship? And how does this all feed into culture? So we, with our program, really wanted to explore this a bit more, the sort of social aspects of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the program information, in terms of who it's for in the audience, with this program, we have targeted groups of all sizes, often with a shared background or a common profession, That could include the lenders, for example. So with Northern Wisconsin, I was working on getting a group of people in the capital community or lending community together, lawyers, accountants, elected officials, could be local, regional economic development professionals. That was the primary focus of a group we worked with in Missouri, educators as well. It could be different, often with a shared background. We offer Homegrown in either 2 shorter sessions or a day-long format. We have about 4 modules that are more substantial and need about an hour to an hour and a half for each one. And then we come to the community for the most part when we can. During COVID, we took this online, which I'll talk a little bit about, but we like to be workshopping with communities when we can. And working with the local extension agent as they're available. And then why, Jenny Beth talked about this too. Entrepreneurship is a critical component of economic development. This is key to job creation, income growth, poverty alleviation, sense of place. We talk about all of this, but we want communities thinking about why they would even come together to focus on the entrepreneurial ecosystem right off the bat. So I'll get in a little bit into each of the modules. And again, this program is relatively young, so I would love to hear feedback, or if there's comments in the chat, I welcome any suggestions for things we could be or should be covering with our modules. So in module 1, again, we like to start with why. So why would we even come together to talk about entrepreneurship? So we get into some local data that would cover job creation. We talk about innovation, the sense of place, income growth, poverty alleviation, all of those benefits I just discussed. So people can see if this is an economic development strategy that they want to pursue or not, and kind of be weighing the benefits and cons. A lot of communities in Wisconsin are also thinking about business recruitment, for example. So why would we invest in entrepreneurship when we're been focused for so long on recruiting, a large manufacturer, for example? So helping them look at different economic development strategies. And I would say the customized data and discussion around why is really the focus of module 1. In module 2, we're trying to get people to think broadly about entrepreneurship in their community, that it's not just downtown businesses, for example, that it is home-based businesses, that it is the sort of one-man and one-woman shops, that non-employer businesses without paid employees, are the large majority of businesses in any given place we go. It's not just the large manufacturing that's maybe out by the interstate, that it's all different kinds. We talk about the age of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, for the most part, are older than we think they are. We talk about businesses owned by people of color, by women, by veterans. We really want to be thinking inclusively so that when people are engaging on the topic of entrepreneurship, that we have inclusive programming, that we're looking at the whole community of entrepreneurs. And I think that's especially important when we're looking at that non-employer segment that I mentioned, the one-man and one-woman shops that might be working from home, for example. They tend to be harder to find. They might not be in the phone book. They don't have a storefront. So if we're interested in supporting entrepreneurship locally, finding those folks and more intentionally identifying and reaching out to them might be a really important part of the equation. And we know that that's a really important part of the pipeline. So many of those have intentions of hiring one day. They might go on to be large employers. So helping them early on get to that next stage could be really important. With module 3, this is where we get more into networking. So I consider module 1 and 2 sort of entrepreneurship 101. In module 3, we start to talk about the different components of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Why is everybody important? When are entrepreneurs interacting with folks in the various segments of the ecosystem? We go through several different examples. We talk about networks as a source of support, information, resources, help, and opportunities, and really emphasize relationships. A lot of times when people are thinking about networks, they think about connections between organizations. So how is a business maybe connected to the economic development organization or to the bank or to the school system? And we like to emphasize that even if we're talking about connections between organizations, we're ultimately talking about connections between people. It's because Susan knows, you know, Jake at one institution to another and can pick up the phone and call that person. So it's really about interpersonal connections, and that can make all the difference in terms of accessing resources. And maybe that's a money resource, or maybe that's an opportunity, for example. There's some really interesting research in economics right now about how job opportunities come about through our network, perhaps more so than, you know, an online posting or something like that. So we know when we think about a network map, the way I think about it is channels through which resources flow. So a relationship is a channel through which information flows, through which maybe money flows, help, opportunities. Oh, you need to hire someone. Well, have you talked to so-and-so? I know they were looking. Oh, you're looking for a location. Well, so-and-so, the real estate agent, just had a place come up. So this sort of real-time private information exchanges can be really important for entrepreneurs. And we see that in networks that have a lot of reciprocity, that people are sharing different types of information, kind of knowing at some point information will flow back to them that will be valuable. So we want to have strong relationships across the community with different parts of the ecosystem. So participants complete network and generosity worksheets during this model. And we talk about generosity. This comes from some colleagues of mine here at UW-Madison Extension who have done programming in network and development and have found that this generosity component, this planned acts of generosity component, is a key way to strengthen relationships and more intentionally going about building rapport with someone. So reaching out with information, with a compliment, with an offer to help can be a really easy and natural way to make an initial contact with someone that's really easy and get that relationship going. I think it's so much more easier to reach out with an act of generosity than it is to reach out with an ask. And so if you start by thinking about how can I really genuinely offer to be generous or helpful towards somebody, that is a much more comfortable way of moving forward with new relationships than waiting until you need something. We want those relationships in place. And then with module 4, we talk about network development. So we discuss how and why networks vary from person to person. So this is an opportunity to discuss equity. So in particular for women and people of color, oftentimes their less networked position in a community has very real consequences for their success as entrepreneurs, so actual tangible consequences. So we talk about why certain people might be less networked and how we could build networks equitably for everyone. In a lot of rural communities, we see this conversation happen in connection with newcomers a lot. So I'm from a very small town, and if your grandparents were not born there, then you are not from my hometown. It takes, quite a long time to be considered part of the community, and quite a long time to network yourself in. So thinking about how we treat newcomers, and not just them as a person, but new ideas, right? This extends to how welcome we are to new ideas and doing things differently. This is a place for that conversation as well. Module 5 is the action plan. And depending on who we're working with and what their expertise are, how much time we have, This looks a lot different. It varies from community to community with expertise and experience of the participants. So most recently, I was in Arcadia, Wisconsin, and the group decided to design an intentional networking event. So rather than just invite a bunch of people who show up, they kind of used their network maps that they had created in the workshop and sort of were trying to cross-pollinate their network. So looking at their neighbors, seeing, oh, you know, so-and-so, I would like to meet them, I could invite them. And so developing a really intentional networking event to connect people from across different participants' networks. We've also imagined that people might want to start a pitch contest. Groups may use their networks to develop a local resource roadmap. So we kind of borrowed this idea from Kansas City SourceLink, which is another great entity, but how can we lay out for entrepreneurs all the different available resources and take out some of maybe the informal relationship making that advantages some entrepreneurs and disadvantages others. If we have some sort of centralized roadmap, maybe that would be helpful. And we can provide a resource, a directory of service providers and helpers. And then module 6, we call the follow-up. And usually Sarah and I are state specialists, and oftentimes our local partner is really key in that follow-up and making sure whatever action plan actually is implemented and executed. So we did some pilots. Again, this program is relatively young. So you see we have some pilots here on the left-hand screen. So we started with Leadership Fond du Lac. That was a group of adults in Fond du Lac that we did over Zoom during the pandemic. Then a high school reached out to us and said, you know, could you do some entrepreneurship programming with high schoolers? And we hadn't really thought of running Homegrown with high schoolers. But it was a ton of fun, and we are going to do it again. So that was really exciting. We were working with an FBLA group. We worked with Northwest Missouri. So that is a group of economic development professionals. We were in Arcadia, Wisconsin as well, working with some entrepreneurs themselves, as well as we had economic development professionals, lenders, some people from their major employer. So it was a more diverse group. And then upcoming, we're looking forward to working with the Girl Scouts of the Northwestern Great Lakes. We have another group coming in West Central Missouri, and then the public libraries in Wisconsin. So the public libraries have come together and said, we want to be part of supporting the startup community, but they're exploring how to do that. So this was sort of a great opportunity to get an entity that's maybe on the fringe and starting to see themselves as part of the ecosystem and more intentionally direct their efforts, perhaps. I have a couple of lessons learned to share. So one is, you know, to simplify and do less. We started this program with a lot of stuff, and I think the beauty of it now is kind of in the simplicity. That refers to content. Even with, we had some networking activities that, you know, people were drawing, and we could tell from our evaluation it just wasn't landing. So we took some steps to simplify. Our evaluations themselves were kind of complex, so we've taken that down to a more simple follow-up. We know that guest speakers are the best part. So we have local entrepreneurs speaking at every workshop that we do. Our local partner is really critical. We lean on them so much for developing the program for each location specifically, local stories, local examples, local data, the local flavor and fiber of the community. We really like to learn as much as we can from our local partners on that. It was great to try new audiences. I was hesitant at first, but it worked out great. We had some challenges with Zoom. We found, you know, maybe 12 to 15 participants is ideal. Mixed format was hard when we were all on Zoom, but we had a classroom that was all together, if that makes sense. So that was difficult. Like, having each person individually on their own device worked better than a classroom full of people, and then the facilitators on Zoom. But just different challenges that come with being online. One day are set with routine. So we have liked it when we can do it all in one day or integrate ourselves into a set meeting, for example. That has worked well. This is just a picture of working with the high schoolers. That was pretty fun, and what it looked like. We had a recent graduate, Charlie, join us to help with the high school event, which was really insightful. Charlie just recently graduated from high school and was an FBLA himself, so he could kind of make sure that we were not too out of date and with the times in terms of how we presented our material and what kind of things we shared with that group. Considerations for success. Again, I mentioned the local partner is really critical. We now spend a lot of time prepping with our guest speakers. We're able to incentivize them. We spend meetings in advance talking with them about what we're teaching them and looking for parallels between what they'll talk about and the content so that those two things really go together. Local data and stories, I mentioned already. Choosing the audience, we really want to get people that maybe are not already sold on entrepreneurship. I don't know that we would have a lot new to offer them. We also don't necessarily want to get people that are not on board. In Wisconsin, we have some people that, you know, we're a manufacturing community and that's what we're going to stick with. But those public libraries that are just starting to think about entrepreneurship, these people that are, you know, on the fence and looking for a way to involve themselves, I think that's really a great audience for us to work with. So being intentional about the groups we choose has helped. Meals and prizes, making it fun, those types of things I think always are part of Extension when we can do it. We're starting to add graphic recording, which I'm really excited about. So this is a way of sort of visual note-taking, and that I think is so important when we're talking about the ecosystem and networking. There's definitely a visual component of that. And I think having people see it as they're talking about it and have someone visually capture that local knowledge, having somebody visually capture what that network looks like and all the pieces could be really powerful. So we're exploring this now. The one we are working with now can work with a recording or over Zoom, so it's really flexible. We're excited about that. And most importantly, I think it gives communities a product at the end. They have something to look at, something to refer to, something to hang, where they'll all see it. It can be a tool for follow-up. Hey, we all talked about this and we have this plan moving forward. So I think having something to see at the end is really important. And this is something I borrowed from some other programs in Extension that I've learned a lot from. And then last, I just want to touch on our next steps. If anybody out there is interested, we're working on packaging this with speaker notes, a train the trainer manual, a participant workbook, so things are kind of ready to go. So having our slides and all the supplemental materials with it is the goal. And we're excited about new partners and expanding to other states as well. So here's the contact information for Sarah and I, if anybody is interested. And I want there to be time for comments and questions, so I will stop there. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Tessa. That is so interesting. We're a small group, so please feel free to either put a question in the chat or unmute yourself. Well, I have a question or maybe a comment for Jenny Beth first. So I think it's very interesting that fear of failure was one of the things, one of the factors that you came up with, or that bubbled up from the smaller community, but that didn't reflect in the larger community. Do you have any? I mean, I think I have thoughts about it, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a saving face component, and that's something that kind of came through in the qualitative part. You know, when you're in a small town, everybody knows you. And, you know, if something goes wrong, it could be considered embarrassing to some, even though we know that that's a part of life and you learn from it and move on. But that's definitely a component. There were also familial issues, concerned about their families and the income that they would lose because of the failure of that particular business. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think those two were the main components that emerged from the qualitative part. But of course, fear of failure comes from a lot of different things too. And so one of the limitations is we're relying on what they're telling us as well. And so they might not be sharing everything too.
Good afternoon. It's good to see everyone on the call today. Tessa, I'm so glad that you were able to join us and deliver the interesting talk today. I did want to ask, when I try to start up entrepreneurship programs, usually mayors and local economic development officials and others look at me like I've got three heads, like, what are you talking about? I had one mayor once say, Michael, I'll worry about entrepreneurship when I learn how to spell it. And so, which I thought was pretty funny. Welcome to Tennessee, a pretty classic Tennessean phrase. But how do you sell the potential return on investment, or how do you help them? You mentioned home-based businesses, and the entrepreneurs come in a lot of different flavors. So how do you sort of present the data to them? I know you and Sarah have published in this realm, like what is an entrepreneur, defining entrepreneurship, and then helping articulating to them what the return on investment is, investing in these folks, because they often kick back to me, oh, well, the failure rate is so high, or so on and so forth. But I try to remind them that small businesses are those that generate the vast majority of jobs in their community, and starting up and retaining those businesses is really the key to building a robust economy in their local community. So how have you successfully sort of sold it?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think there are a couple of challenges to entrepreneurship. So one is, why would we support entrepreneurs if half of these businesses aren't going to be here in 5 years? It's much more splashy to have one new employer with 100 businesses than it is to have 50 businesses with 2 employees. So the visibility and sort of political weight, I think, favors the sort of industrial recruitment model. So I do see those challenges. I really lean on the research. Maybe not every community is going to choose entrepreneurship, but I think the research shows that there's a pretty compelling case for entrepreneurs as a source of job creation, as you pointed out. We also have seen from research that places with more entrepreneurship have higher incomes, and that's measured at the country, regional, and individual level. So I also think that's pretty compelling. In rural areas, we know about poverty alleviation. And I think Sarah and I too, particularly in rural communities, that there's sort of an underappreciation for how businesses contribute to our local sense of place. So maybe the childcare provider is not ever going to employ 25 people, but they're a really important part of quality of life and the fabric of that community. And even if they're only, or even if they're not creating jobs for other people, they're still creating a job for one person themselves. And I think in rural communities that have had pretty tepid job growth for at least a decade, that is important too. So we do lean on the sort of the job growth, the economic benefits, and then these sort of softer benefits as well in terms of identity and, recruiting people of where to live. They're going to be looking at the bakery and the coffee shop. I have one community that I just worked with. They're, like, we used to have a bakery. We don't have a bakery. It's just so interesting, the things that people grab onto as their local gathering places, their local watering holes that do stitch people together in rural places. So those are the things that I talk about.
Great. Tess, I see that you have a question in the chat related to how you evaluated the outcomes of the program offering.
So we mostly look at changes in knowledge and changes in understanding. So we're looking for people like, did you know that you were part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem beforehand? And do you see it now? So that's sort of an exciting change for us of like, oh, I didn't even know that I could have an impact. I didn't even know that I could have an influence. So we do generally see increases across these types of metrics. One of the things that we like to ask an evaluation that's not as concrete is, what's one thing you plan on doing as a result of this program? And we get some actual action items from people about, oh, I'm going to reach out to these entrepreneurs, or, now I have this really simple tool for connecting with the entrepreneurial community, and I can use it starting right now. I don't have to, continue to practice or develop a new skill set. Like, these are easy things that I can do now. So those are some of the more exciting outcomes. I will say though that the program is young. We've just been doing pilots over the last year or so. So seeing some of those long-term benefits, we just aren't there yet.
Great, thanks. As I say in class, I always have a question, but any other questions from any of the audience? I wonder if you could both actually speak to how I mean, one thing that COVID has brought about is work from home, the thing that entrepreneurs could be, and we can work from anywhere. So basically entrepreneurs could be anywhere now. And it seems to me both of what you guys have done really relates to this being able to recruit entrepreneurs into your rural communities. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. I know that I'm taking a little bit of field from your, but I think that would be relevant.
Yeah, I feel like we will see more and more opportunities because we are more remote and people are able to live in more rural areas and live where they want to, so that they are not stuck to a geographic location that they don't want to be. And so it's been interesting to read some of the new research that's coming out, kind of stating that people are leaving urban areas. They want to be in more of a rural or suburban setting. And ultimately, as long as the telecommunication infrastructure is there, then I think that's possible. Now, we have heard through our research that not every community has broadband or vast access to the internet. And that, of course, would be a barrier. But as that continues to move forward and get better for all communities, then we should be able to continue to grow populations in these rural areas. At least that's my perspective.
Oh, I agree. I think that the telecommunications or broadband in particular is really important for entrepreneurs. You know, maybe they're fine leaving the city, but when they're looking of where to go and they can choose between a place with broadband or without, that the broadband really does matter. I have almost been thinking about this though from the other perspective. So yes, I think, you know, broadband, I also think entrepreneurs look for support, like they are checking out what kind of services that they can get when they move into the community. So I've definitely heard anecdotes along those lines. But part of it for me too is getting our economic development organizations to think broadly about reaching entrepreneurs. So now you have this whole new set of people potentially to reach. In Wisconsin, for example, we are a popular destination sometimes for like Chicago-based retirees who maybe have a lakefront home somewhere in Wisconsin. They are newly retired or they're near retirement. So sometimes we have our sort of entrepreneurship blinders on, and if somebody's not, you know, 33 and in tech, we don't see them as an entrepreneur. So if we can broaden our lens to see this group of people that's moving in with a lot of human capital, you know, they've had years of work experience, you know, maybe some education. They've also maybe had some time to accumulate some financial savings. Those are two really important ingredients for entrepreneurship, the human and financial capital. And then they're maybe ready to retire, but they're not ready to leave productivity entirely. So it's this opportunity to start that hobby business or that consulting business on the side. And so if we can think about these new people that we have moving in, how do we welcome them? What are our attitudes about thinking about more than just downtown businesses? I think that's also a growth edge for a lot of rural communities.
Great, thank you. Well, we're almost at that time. Any other pressing question? I'm sure that Jenny, Beth, and Tessa will be happy to hear from you offline as well about their research and their programs. Well, I do want to make sure that I don't forget to tell you that our next webinar is October 28th. At 3 p.m. and it'll be Dr. Sarah Lowe, who we've heard a lot about. And she's going to be talking about insights for rural healthcare resilience, a quantitative survey analysis. So I hope that you will join us next month for that webinar. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jenny Beth. Thank you, Tessa. This was so interesting.
Thank you for hosting us. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you so much.